Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Grow Yours podcast, where we talk to coaches, consultants, and entrepreneurs alike about their business, who they help, and why they help them. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Dan Docherty. Am I saying that correctly?
You got it.
All right, perfect. Who is the president and chief coaching officer at BrainTrust, and also the co-creator of NeuroCoaching methodology, which is his book. Correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. So before I keep asking him if I'm right about all the things he does, I'm going to let him come in and take it away. Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory on me.
Sure.
I'll make it brief because I'm getting older, so it's a longer story now. But I'll take you all the way back. I was really fortunate. I grew up as a blue collar kid in Northern Ohio, and my dad was a tool and die apprentice that kind of worked his way up through the ranks and really sent us as a first generation to college. And kind of along that journey, I learned kind of the love of music, and I was really fortunate to have a number of really key people in my story, as all of us have. And one of those for me growing up was a high school music teacher, and when I realized I wasn't going to be a world-class athlete, I got introduced to this ninth grade music teacher that really had a tremendous impact on me in music and the arts and leadership and teamwork and all that. So when you fast forward after college, I was really passionate about leadership. I probably didn't know it then, but I went into the pharmaceutical industry, and most of my time in pharma was in and around neuroscience, so epilepsy, depression, ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, and so on. And I was one of those really lucky young people that at 25, 26 got an opportunity to lead people. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm not so sure I still know what I'm doing, but I had that opportunity. And then through leading those teams and having our teams have success, I'll take you all the way fast forward now past all that stuff and get into a little bit about why I do what I do, and I want to take people back, and maybe this will have some impact for some of your listeners out there. But, for me, sometimes you get the biggest lessons when you're in the lower moments, not in the mountaintops, and I had one of those moments where our company was held by private equity, and we had grown quite a bit, and I went from a sales and marketing leader to an operations leader. And all of a sudden, I don't know if you ever have had this with you, but all of a sudden the pressure was winning, and the stress was winning, and I wasn't coaching well, and I wasn't leading well, and I wasn't walking the floor, and I was carrying that back and forth to home, and I was wanting to get up a little bit later every day. And I just realized that there had to be a change and a pivot, and thought all the way back to those early days of leadership and those early days in high school and college. And I took like the big leap, and the big leap was leaving the C-suite. And at 47 years old with 2 kids in private college, I made the leap to go back and get a PhD. And I really wanted to study, which is amazingly that it has led me to you, but really wanted to study kind of what's that leader team member impact. And I never really had a coaching framework that I thought was worth anything. And I met Jeff Bloomfield, my partner, along the way. And what he was doing coming out of Genentech was sales performance. I was like, I'm kind of trying to have leaders have more impact in every conversation they have, and doing it through neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and emotional intelligence and all that good stuff. And that kind of led me to finish that degree at 50. I graduated in COVID, but I wasn't like an undergrad 20-year-old in COVID. I was a PhD 50-year-old during COVID. And, and I've been very fortunate the last 5 years to take that research, take my background, take the goods and bads of leadership, and lead us all the way to NeuroCoaching, which we've had, very fortunate to have thousands of people use our framework and hopefully maximize their impact in communication. And, and now here we sit today. So 3 beautiful kids, been married for 34 years to the same person, love of my life, very blessed, very fortunate, but that's a little bit of my background.
That's funny because I also graduated during COVID, but I was 22.
You mean we're not the same?
I mean, all people are the same to some extent, right?
To some extent, that's for sure.
All right. Awesome. So I want to talk about that early leadership that you were able to conduct with other people. What exactly were you leading them on? What was your leadership role?
Yeah, so I was, it's interesting, growing up, as I mentioned, in Cleveland, when I got into pharmaceuticals, and I was a rep, carrying the bag, doing all those things. and I get this opportunity to lead. And ironically, I was in Southern Ohio at the time. And ironically, I get this opportunity back in Cleveland. The team had not won anything in 12, 13 years. So I was in the pharmaceutical industry running, and this was a sales oriented team. And I'm like 25, 26 years old. And ironically, the gentleman that I took the place of was my former neighbor who got me into the industry, who was a friend of my dad's. And so all of a sudden, after 13 years of leading Cleveland, he gets moved into a different position, and they asked me to take over that team. So you want to talk about leadership challenge, like right out of the gate. All of a sudden, you're sitting across from your neighbor who watched you grow up at 26 years old, taking over his team for 13 years. I rarely tell this story, just so you know. And and I had one of those very first critical conversation moments, where I looked at him. I think my knees were literally shaking under the table. We were at a Perkins restaurant on Bagley Road in Cleveland, Ohio. I'll never forget it. And I remember him saying to me that, he was extremely proud of me for where I've gotten. He said, and you'll realize as you hire people that do amazing things, even though I felt like he felt like he was wrongly demoted, he's like, I couldn't be more proud of you. And then I had, a little bit of the courage to say, well, here's the deal. I need to know whether you're with me or not with me. And I believe every conversation should be one of both trust and truth. And he said, yeah, I'm with you, and he proved that to be very true. So this former neighbor of mine, I'm leading salespeople at 26 years old, and the team that had won nothing in 13 years, we won one national contest, we won a second national contest, and the gentleman that I replaced, he was at the top of the leaderboard for our sales organization both years in a row. So, that was kind of the environment that I walked into.
Sounds pretty intense, honestly.
Yeah, it was a great growth moment. I didn't know what I was doing. But I will tell you, though, looking back now, I wish I knew what I know now. And for younger listeners, and you're a young person, it's like I realized early on the power of relational coaching and the power of trust and the power of truth. And I didn't know the neuroscience behind it at the time, but what I did know is, man, if you really build that relationship and it's authentic and you stay in the fire with people, it actually doesn't mean you're a soft coach. It actually opens up the mind to innovation, creativity, problem solving, all of those things. I just didn't know the science behind it, which I do now, but I got lucky, my instincts were pretty good. I was a pretty good coach. And, and I was known as the quote guy. I used to always put a quote at the end of my field team members, every ride visit. I carried a quote book in my pocket. Never knew that had any impact whatsoever. And they're like, yeah, we call you the quote guy. And I'm like, no, I had no idea. But anyway, I had quotes. And that was, again, that empathic, compassionate type of leadership style. So when I needed to kind of kick them in the, I could do that, but I did it through love and compassion. I just didn't know until later in life that, wow, there's actually science behind why that has an impact. If you study the great coaches and great leaders in the world, you'll see that a lot of them, they all have different formulas, slightly different formulas, but there's usually an element of connection and compassion that sits in there because they really desire to help that person, that athlete, that performer really, get to places that they can't see them getting themselves.
So you were in this coaching position, right? And then you mentioned earlier the stress was getting to you. It was getting hard to get up in the morning. What was really the one moment where you realized you needed to make that change? Because I'm sure there was a ton of stuff, but there had to be one thing that flipped the switch. What was that?
I love it. I studied at Case Western Reserve University. I proudly say that I studied under Richard Boyatzis, who's, he doesn't like me probably to say this, but, one of the godfathers of emotional intelligence with Daniel Goleman. And, very, very fortunate to find him at Case Western. But yeah, so we called those kind of tipping points. And there was that tipping point. And actually there was two of them, but I'll give you one. The very first one that like immediately comes to recall was I was writing a performance evaluation. And it's like, man, I hate these things. I hate writing them. People hate getting them. And it's this really kind of sometimes destructive tool at times that yet most leaders had to either use them and also, deliver those things every year. And I absolutely hate it. I'm like, there's got to be a better way than this, and I don't know if it was really the chicken or the egg. Like the stress had gotten me so much that I hated to write the review, or I hated to write the review. And that just happened to flow into the fact that, it was driving some stress for me. But there was really that moment, and then, you know, kind of really close, kind of akin to that. And I think probably your listeners would be like, we all have these tipping points in life, you know, and Malcolm Gladwell writes about that. A lot of people write about these tipping points. And the reality is like, are you aware enough? And which is self-awareness. And are you paying attention to the emotions and the things that are happening that are causing behavioral shifts that create new patterns that sometimes are both good patterns and sometimes destructive patterns? And for me at that point, because I'm not a drinker or things like that, but at that point, the stress was becoming a little bit of a destructive pattern. And for me on the inside, not, I could fake it on the outside, but on the inside it wasn't. So, you know, all of that. And then I realized that the last point I'll say is because it was a Saturday morning when I was on my computer to typing, and my wife's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm looking at PhD programs. And she's like, why? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, but there's got to be a better answer than this. You know, I'm a faith-based person. So for me, that path kind of opened up, you know, and she was right there in my corner. And she's like, you know, I'll go back to school teaching so we can have insurance, and you go do what you got to do, you know. And she stayed right with me, you know. And so, but I realized if I didn't, the reality is I was going to get sick.
The reason I ask is, I'm always really big on like that one moment, that tipping point moment, because when I was younger, I read this series of books. It was called the Pendragon series. I don't know if you ever heard of it,
Mm-mm.
but it was fictional. But essentially, the entire series was based on this guy who travels from dimension to dimension, world to world. I don't really remember. I was pretty young, and he influences that. Like every world has its tipping point, right? Every society, every civilization, where either things get really good or really bad. And there was an evil guy who would try to influence it to the bad, and then like there was this group of guardians who would go and try to influence it, obviously the opposite direction. And everybody that I talked to on the podcast, when I talk to them about their backstory, that tipping point is always so drastic sounding, but it's something that people experience every day. So I wonder if my listeners are ever listening to that, like, hey, that happened to me. Did I miss the point? Was I supposed to make a change there? And I think that's really helpful to the listeners.
Yeah, I think there's so many of those, to your point, there's so many of those things that happen in all of our lives. And I like to really look at life as a journey. You know, somebody once told me, they're like, you know, you wouldn't want to be judged off of one chapter of a very long book. You just open up to that chapter. And sometimes in those chapters, you have those tipping points. And what I love about people that are really self-aware is that, and they allow people in, and they're not so full of themselves that they're not coachable. They don't listen. You know, they have a little bit of love and curiosity kind of like deep down in their core, you know, that you can start to see those things. And which is why, you know, accountability groups and support groups and therapy and all those things are so important in life. Having a great coach, which is, you know, my field of expertise, is helping people be great coaches. You know, that's why we exist at BrainTrust. It's pretty simple, but I'm right with you. There's so many of those tipping points, and we kind of call it the stoplight, like kind of like the stoplights. You know, I've had tipping points where I've blown right through the red light. You know, and sometimes when you blow through red light after red light after red light after red light, you get those moments where like all of a sudden you wake up, you're like, wow, what's happened? You know, and that's why when people, like you just talk about, you know, if you go on vacation or you go away, there's some people who think about over the holidays when people shut down for a week or two, if they're fortunate enough to be able to do that, and they get off the treadmill and they get sick. You know, like, well, why do they get sick? It's like because their central nervous system and this whole system we have is saying, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on? You're slowing down. Why are you slowing down? And then your defense mechanisms come down. And, you know, and I want people to understand that this stuff that I love to teach, because I'm a teacher and coach, is that, you know, their life is at stake, you know, and if you're not aware of those moments as we're describing, you know, it is impacting your health. And we get information flooding so fast at us now that we have to be able to slow down in order to recognize those moments. Or if not, somebody's going to knock on your door and be like, you'll recognize it sometimes when it's too late.
Very interesting. So you were fortunate enough to recognize your tipping point. You go back to school, and now BrainTrust exists. You want to tell everybody what? I mean, you briefly just mentioned it, that you're helping other coaches, but you want to get a little bit more in the weeds there of exactly what you guys do and how you help people?
Since we're in the storytelling mode, I'll just give a very brief kind of quick story about, you know, how I got to BrainTrust. So BrainTrust was actually kind of the brainchild of Jeff Bloomfield, who's our founder. And Jeff was working at Genentech at the time, and they were launching a brain cancer drug. And Jeff was just this really amazing, still is amazing storyteller. And he was, as they were studying that, he all of a sudden got this epiphany, maybe it was a tipping point, I don't know, looking at science through the lens of communication and great communicators. And he realized, wow, we trained salespeople backwards. We train them so much on product that when they get under stress and pressure, what happens to sales professionals? They go to their highest level of training and they throw all this knowledge out, but yet there's no trust, there's no really understanding their story, there's no creating some urgency that's also done through a level of authenticity and personal connection, and they go boom right to their product. So he's called his wife and said, we're moving back to Cincinnati, which is where our company is. And he's like, I'm going to start a company that's going to help sales professionals communicate with more impact through the foundations of neuroscience, behavioral psychology, that's going to put our framework in a certain order that's going to help them drive decision making through the customers that they serve faster. And that's how it started, and it was Jeff, a whiteboard, and a project manager, and that was 14 years ago. I met him 7 years ago, so about halfway down that journey, when I was actually in my doctoral program. And I was explaining to Jeff what I was doing in the leadership coaching space. And he says, wow, that's what I do in the sales space. But so if you think of our company, and I appreciate you asking the question, is, we're there to help people communicate with more impact, influenced by AI. You can't get away from that now. It makes us more efficient. So we have all that. But just as, and probably more importantly, is that personal effectiveness for sellers is what became NeuroSelling. And Jeff wrote story-based selling, and then he wrote NeuroSelling, and we just released NeuroSelling 2.0 that we're co-authors on. And then we moved and said, wow, there's a lot of that different framework, but that same communication focus for leaders. And if you think about it, 30, 40, 50 conversations a day, everything from text messaging to picking up the phone, I think people still do that, to, face-to-face meetings, virtual meetings like this. There's so many communication points, is that we wanted to give leaders an intentional way of communicating. So if you think about our company, people call us, they're like, wow, we're not driving enough sales. And we're like, well, maybe it's because they don't communicate that well. And the same thing with leaders, where they'll call and say, well, I got engagement issues, productivity issues, retention issues. We're like, well, have you created a culture of coaching? And that became NeuroSelling and NeuroCoaching. And, now 14 years later, here we are, really fortunate to work with a lot of amazing companies around the globe. But those are the two things we do. We're, if anyone's listening, we're not a McKinsey or a Bain, nothing wrong with those, but we're not a strategic consulting house. We're a skill-based training company that focuses on communication.
So when it comes to communication, what's more important, what you're saying or how you say it?
Ooh, that's a really good question. What you're saying or how you're saying it? Am I allowed to say both?
Yeah, sure. I could elaborate on it a little bit if it helps make it more clear.
Yeah, make it a little more clear, and then I'll tell you why my instinct was to say both, and I'll see if my answer changes.
Okay, sure. So I'm a person who, I wouldn't say I'm like extremely articulate, right? I wouldn't say my vocabulary is super vast or anything like that, but I feel like I'm really good at getting my point across, even with simple, short words. And I feel like that's because of how I say it and how I carry myself.
Yeah.
So I always thought I am a marketer, so I understand copywriting. Like, you do, to an extent, what you say does matter. But for me in life, I feel like it's always been how I say it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So when I was thinking both, let's go into the how I say it first.
Sure.
So if I ask you a question and like as an example, and I say, "Why'd you do that?" and I use a tone that your listeners probably go, "Ooh, that dude's mad." That something's going on there. Like, there's an emotion that's happening that changed the entire how he said that. I can use the exact same words, and if I lower my voice, I'm like, "Why did you do that?" The how, I use the exact same words, but the how through tonality is very different. So I do think that words matter. And so what we're saying and how we're saying it both matter. But what I find in communication is I don't know let's go back to you said marketing for a second.
Sure.
You think about how much research a brand does just on the color of its logo or on a catchphrase or a tagline or whatever that might be. Millions and millions of dollars sometimes on a little phrase, And so so what they say does matter because their customers are saying, yeah, that matters. But man, how you say it really matters, because what I would drop down to from a science perspective is, let's just talk about how I say things to build trust, actually enrich and expand conversations. As an example, I'm going to take like our ability to connect personally. I'm going to bet all day, because of the science, that, and like oxytocin and dopamine and all these neurochemicals in our brain, that if we do that first, and I can follow that up with, yeah, I'm also credible. I think that order matters. So in this case, on your question, I think what we say matters, and how we say it matters. So think about it this way. In questioning, we teach this little formula called M plus S plus T equals I. And that M is motivation. Like, what's your motivation for asking the question? How do you structure the question? And then what's your tone of that question in order to drive impact? Same thing. It doesn't have to be a question, but if I'm phrasing something, I don't have to use these long words and like, ooh, wow, that's like really crazy impressive. People are going to read the emotion, and it's called emotional contagion, the emotion that you put out, the authenticity that you put out. So as I say that, I would probably, if I had to weight them, if you said, okay, we need them both, because I think we need them both. But if I had to weight it, I'd be like, I'd probably put a little bit more weighting on the how I say it versus the what I say. And the fact that there's just, I believe in in today's society and multiple generations in the workforce. You and I come from different generations. The reality is that, man, when people don't believe that you really care and are connected to them in some way, now, not everybody to the same degree, but man, if you can't develop that relationship, I can say one thing and you might think I might completely misinterpret that. So let's put a little bit more weighting on simple question you asked, but very deep on how we say it. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we also have to be mindful of what we're saying. Deeper the trust, I might be able to get away a little bit more with what I'm saying, because our relationship is so deep.
That makes sense. The reason I'm asking is because I know NeuroCoaching, NeuroSelling, a big part of it is storytelling, right? That's something that you guys touch on a lot in the books. So I figure the how in which something is being said ties into that storytelling a lot.
Yeah, for sure. We teach a lot in NeuroSelling in particular, the power of visual storytelling. And you as a marketer know this, from the London School of Business and from Stanford, our ability to retain information, the more visual it is, the more narrative we put around it, we're more likely at a much higher level percentage-wise, like maybe even up to 70% if you present the same information 3 different ways, through the power of narrative, visuals, and facts. You need all 3 in the formula. But man, so we try to teach people that, yeah, the more that you lean into and you show, like, iconography and different things that create a visual image, they're going to grab that image, and they're going to be like, and if nothing else, they're going to see it and they're going to retain it and they recall it at a higher level. So storytelling is so critical. Now, if I was flipping that on the leadership side, I'd say a little bit different than pictures. It's like, I need to know your story. And with that, because once I know your story, I think at times when I coach people of different generations, they're like, that's warm and fuzzy, man. I don't have time for that. I'm too busy. We're here to do a job. We've got our role clarity. We got this. And I'm like, that's not going to work, because they're going to leave you, and they can, especially in Western culture, and so developing that relationship, I'll do storytelling a little bit different way. It's that understanding of someone's story that actually allows you to create a shared vision that then I can align to the mission and then situationally coach. That's kind of the art form of neurocoaching. It's like, you cannot bypass shared vision. It's not, my research showed that through what I call the relational climate survey that I used in my research. It's been shown from Kouzes and Posner. It's been shown for decades and decades, the power of shared vision. It's a different visual imagery, but we've got to ultimately really, someone says, "Ooh, you know what? You see me. You see me." And man, that is so powerful in leadership and coaching. And I think on the sales side, same thing. When your customer is like, "Wow, you see me, you get me," I actually don't even care if I'm right or wrong. They're like, "Ooh," and that leads you into emotional intelligence, which is the power of empathy. Because that means you're able to see things not only how other people feel it, you can sense that, but you're willing to see things from their perspective. And if anybody's listening to us right now still, and not saying, "Oh, this guy's kind of boring," if they're still listening to us, hopefully what they're picking up is that through sales or leadership or just building personal or professional relationships, we could change the world with perspective taking. Like really understanding somebody else's perspective, because it's actually a derivative definition of empathy. And empathy is an emotional competency that leads to compassion. And that's a great driver for change.
That segues perfectly to what I want to talk about next, because I did want to touch on emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And what I was going to ask you was, wouldn't emotional intelligence be a requirement in order to understand someone else's story? And that is correct, right?
Yeah, I
That's the
totally
first
believe.
part of my question.
So yes, well, yes, because if you can control your own emotions and you can dial that down, you're in more control of that, and you're more likely to be curious and open to listening to their story.
Mm-hmm.
Because the self side of self-management of emotion leads over to social awareness and then ultimately to relationship management. So yes.
Okay. So can you learn or can you develop emotional intelligence?
I'm going to ask you this question in reverse because I just want to see, because if you graduated in 2020 and this is, I think, extremely important because I teach this at a university.
Sure.
So I'm going to lead the witness here. Do you believe that emotional intelligence can be trained, taught, learned, and have impact on relationships?
Me personally,
Mm-hmm.
yes, but I don't think everybody can do it.
Mm,
I think you need some base level. I don't want to say IQ because that sounds like, oh, you're dumb, you don't have good IQ. But yeah, I do believe that you need some sort of base level intelligence in order to develop emotional intelligence. Because I actually think emotional intelligence comes after the standard intelligence, like good at school and good at memorizing and all those things. And then the social intelligence on top of that is what the real titans of the business world, the entertainment world, and everybody has, is they have that understanding of emotional intelligence, not just intelligence.
yeah,
Because
I love it. Go ahead.
I went to a like one of those really specialized high schools, right? Like number 6 in the country, all that stuff. And a lot of the people that I went to school with were very intelligent, but they couldn't really hold a conversation. They couldn't relate to you. They were just STEM kids, you know. They right now all of them are building rockets or trying to cure cancer, like doing amazing things.
Yeah.
But I don't think they'd be able to thrive in the environment that I put myself in every single day, because I don't think they had that next level of intelligence, which is emotional.
Yeah, I love it. So yes, it can be learned. So let's align on that first and foremost.
Okay,
Do people have different aptitude for how that impacts the way that they communicate, the way that they take intelligence off the board for a second? Like, forget the word intelligence. I
sure.
actually don't even like to consider it an intelligence. So just take that off the board. It's different than IQ. I'm born with my IQ. I've got it. I'm not changing it a whole lot. It is what it is. Are some people more emotionally intelligent than others? Yes. Research has shown that women at times, and research have shown to be more emotionally intelligent than men. But can we learn it? Yes, we can. Now, you also have to take that into your situational context and think about how you apply it. Because what I get frustrated with is if I over label that says, "Hey, STEM," and I know you're not saying this, but if I said, STEM kids are super smart, they're creating rockets and curing cancer, but man, they're emotionally not equipped to be able to do that. Well, that's a generalization and a stereotype, and I don't like to do that. What I like to say is, hey, when you walk into certain contexts, let's think about, like, take one of them as an example. Self-awareness. That is, I think most scholars and most emotional intelligence people say, yeah, self-awareness is the first big block. It's like the heartbeat of emotional intelligence. And there's only one major competency in there, and it's emotional self-awareness, at least according to most scholars. So the emotional self-awareness is, how do emotions affect your performance? So if I went to somebody that was an astrophysicist and they're extremely technical and extremely high IQ, I would want to do a lot of really cool deep work that says, I want to ask you first and foremost, when you walk into a certain situation, are you aware of how that situation in that context is going to trigger emotional response that affects your performance? Now, I'm not talking about the extreme poles of, like, if someone has, some kind of neurodivergence where, it's really, really hard to get anything in there. I'm not really talking the extremes. I'm talking the majority of the population. That person I would be working with, I'd be like, yeah, if you're not aware of that, you're going to have a really hard time managing those emotions and being adaptable, which is, adaptability is an emotional competency inside self-management. Self-control, which derails most leaders. Your inability to control emotions and the intensity of the emotions is very dangerous, in some situations. So because if you think about it, when we have problems in life, when you ask me about, like, hey, how did you know that tipping point? Well, that tipping point was a problem. Now, was my awareness high enough that I could, whatever emotional response I put out there, problems naturally evoke emotion. And so as we go through life, can we learn to modulate our response to emotions? Yes, we can. Are people going to do that differently? Yes, they are, which is actually one of the things I absolutely love about coaching, because I am really tired. I'm 57 years old. So here's what I'm really tired of. Emotional intelligence got on the cover of Time magazine like in 1995, 1996. Somebody out there can chat GPT that and fact check us, but it's somewhere in that window of time as a predictor. And then you move all predictor of success, not just in business, but in life. You go all the way now to 2010. And the World Economic Forum is saying, 2020, that this is a top 10 skill that leaders have to have. We're decades apart, man. And I'm like, even if people know the 4 domains of emotional intelligence, do they know the competencies underneath that? But even more importantly, to answer your question, have they ever strategized? Like, wow, that situation is going to cause this emotion. And if that happens, can I manage it? Like, we overthink it. It's like, it's not that complex, man. And what a lot of the scholars, way smarter than me, man. I'm a practitioner. I'm like a practitioner scholar. I'm not a scholar. But what the scholars in this space will tell you is they believe that emotional intelligence should be trained and taught all the way back in elementary school. And there are programs out there in the world, maybe your program was one of that they did put our ability to manage and control emotions and the impact of that on others, that they embedded those into schools. So again, you asked me a question that I gave you a long answer to, but if anyone's listening, can it be trained? Yes. Is it going to look different for every individual? Yes, which is why I believe that, coaching and really the impact of emotional intelligence right alongside your IQ, right alongside a lot of other critical things, your natural skills, your God-given talents that you have relative to a certain job, identifying what those are, which I'm a huge fan of Gallup Strength Finders, understanding those talents that you can invest in to become strengths is all really critical in how we build relationships. And again, I'm working mostly in the organizational context. I'm not a therapist, from clinical psychologist or psychologist perspective. I'm working inside the organizational domain.
Okay, so now I kind of want to tie all this together, right? And bring it into how it's impacted your business and how you've impacted other people's businesses. So let's jump into my field a little bit, the marketing side. So how have you guys used neuroscience to actually grow your marketing? What strategies have you used? How have you found people? How have you shown them what you could do? Tell me all about it.
Yeah. So maybe this might be a bad answer. So you might be like, you need to hire us. But if you think about what your question earlier on what we say and how we say it, that question,
Mhm.
and we talked about, do both of those matter and to maybe what degree? Marketing for us is if you think about the I'll kind of call it the modern approach, if you will, to marketing. For us as we've grown, our first big hurdle was awareness. And so, we were and still are to some degree, more of a boutique firm that's growing. Our platform was growing through thought leadership and content generation and the books and keynote speaking. But with that type of stuff, we can only go so far. We can only get to so many places as a thought leader. But now what's happened with social media and what's happened with putting out, our ability now to get into different vehicles, like, through LinkedIn and through HubSpot and through other communication tools, we know that our content can get further faster. And so what we've realized is that we've evolved from this company that mostly grows through referrals, and that's okay to some point, but if you want to scale, it wasn't good enough for us anymore. And we knew we had to amplify our game relative to our content production, and then amplifying our game relative to the efficiency to get more content out relative to technology with AI and things like that. So if we could increase awareness, then for us, then we could get them either to our website or asking for a book or something like that. And then we knew what happens there. We could get more hits to us. And then if we could amplify what we do relative to having great conversations, we could lead them through that funnel and qualify that, through discovery, get them into qualification faster, go from qualification into, hopefully, closing a deal. So for us, we've had to really spend our time on two attributes. One is getting professional sellers that do what we do in our space, because they still have a purpose in our journey. And then also we had to use tech, web presence, all of those things to really amplify that a little bit more. It almost reminds me of the days back when you would record a record. Shows how old I am. If it was a record, or you put a song out, and the old days doesn't work anymore. You can self-publish and do all those things now and get your art out there in a completely different mechanisms than what we used to be able to do even probably 10 years ago. And so, we're leaning a lot into that, but we are a thought leader awareness type of business. But we made a decision about 3 years ago to scale. And once we made that decision, then everything kind of had to amplify. But I don't think it's as simple as it used to be in the old days. Well, if you want to scale, just add more salespeople.
Yeah.
That used to be the old way, and that I don't think is the formula anymore. And you're the expert in that space, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that's a little bit about how we've done
Oh,
it.
I know that's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, cold calling at the end of the day is the base root of business, right? But no, like you said before, you joked, you said, if people do that anymore, and you were referring to answering the phone. So the space has changed for sure.
Yeah. And you know what else too? I appreciate, I know we're going to run out of time, but appreciate your opinion on this. There's so much in influence now. It's really as a person that's kind of at the last third of their professional journey, it's really fun. Actually, I don't hold any resentment for watching people have influence so fast, and the ability to get the word out about an idea or a product or a service, like, so much faster and so much further than we've ever been in history. I'm talking, global. It's amazing when people hit that influence space. We've wanted to build our business for however long we have it is, not being everything to everyone, and being super capable in our space, and kind of the riches in the niches type of mindset. It wasn't about that for us. And I if anybody ever hires BrainTrust, I just want you to know, for us, I firmly believe that if we have impact with sellers and leaders in their ability to communicate, I think that still matters. And so our philosophy was, let's be great at what we do, like world class at what we do. And then we'll be very fortunate that a lot of world-class companies, will come saying, wow, we'd love for you to help us, and that's because I run delivery in our company. So for me, it's about the experience. Like, you can promise the world, but if we can't deliver, eventually it all breaks down.
All right. I think that's honestly a great note to leave it off at. Dr. Dan, would you like to tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find BrainTrust?
Yeah, well, you can find me personally at dandocherty.com. But even more importantly than that, or more important than that, I'd love for people to go to braintrustgrowth.com. Braintrust Growth is all one word. So braintrustgrowth.com to check us out. If you're interested in either one of our books, they're available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So that's NeuroSelling 2.0. And our most recent release is NeuroCoaching. So that's how they can find us.
All right. Awesome. Everybody, this has been an extremely deep and enlightening episode for me, honestly. So I hope all the listeners feel the same. And this has been the Grow Yours podcast. Until next time.